I want to thank Brandon Srot very much for joining us this afternoon for this session on looking after one's mental health in this period of lockdown and just the general psychological pressure of the COVID crisis. I think Brando, for all his youth, is one of the most respected and, in fact, beloved members of the Sydney Jewish community, who spent many years working for communal organisations and making a huge contribution to the vibrancy of the life of the Sydney Jewish community. He's more recently gone into work as a therapist, training and work as a therapist, and it's in that role that we speak to him this afternoon. But of course, with a huge knowledge of the Jews of Sydney and the community. So really a person who's extraordinarily well placed to talk to members of our community about the challenges we're facing. I think the way we will organise it is I have a few questions for Brando, which I'd like him to discuss for us, and then we'll open the floor, and we're going until 3:30. So hopefully people will be able to raise any issues which haven't been discussed already, and to ask their own questions. And I want to welcome everyone who's on this call, and it's really good to see you and to have you with us. And I hope everyone is doing really well at the moment. So Brando, welcome again. First of all, I want to ask you, how are you doing? How's your family doing? How is your inner community doing?
Well, hello to you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you all to have this conversation together. I'm very touched by your indulgent introduction, so I hope I can live up to the expectation you have set for the community. But to answer your question, I am, thank God, doing very well. I have been very grateful, and I still am very grateful for the fact that I have good health at this time. I have shelter, I have food, I have loving relationships that I'm surrounded by. So yeah, I'm doing well. And there was a period of time where my partner's uncle and cousin in America actually both had coronavirus. But I'm happy to report that they are both doing very well, and they're over it, and all is well.
Excellent. That's very good to hear. Now, maybe you could just say a little bit more about yourself, and also about your training as a therapist, your professional and clinical background.
Sure. So I'm sure you can hear from my accent that I grew up in South Africa. I lived there till I was 18. So I moved to Australia 20 years ago, and I've also lived in Israel for 3 years. And as you said, I worked for many years in the Jewish non-profit sector. But during that time, I also went to train as a psychotherapist. So my initial training was really founded on psychodynamic therapy and family systems therapy and group therapy. That was really the foundation of my training. And then after my initial training, I went to do a bit of a specialization in Gestalt therapy. I don't know if this means anything to anyone, but these are the technical names. And I've pretty much worked in private practice ever since. I did do a bit of time working at corrective services with criminals on parole back in the community, and spent some time working at the AIDS Council of New South Wales as well as a therapist. So yeah, most of my work today is in psychotherapy, but I also still do a lot of work in leadership development and in facilitation. So I hope that's enough of a background and context to where I'm coming to for this conversation.
Thank you. Now, what do you think are the major challenges that we're all facing in terms of good mental health, considering the impact that COVID is having on all of us?
This is a great question. And while I have some thoughts of an answer, I'd also posit here that we may not even really know just yet how we're being impacted in terms of our mental health and mental well-being, because we're still in it in such a big way. But I think that at the outset, I would, my first thought here goes to anxiety and to fear. And I recognize that in Australia, we're at a different place to other countries around the world. But I think that there's still a lot of anxiety around what's going on here and what will happen and how will our lives be when, I don't know, when we're beyond this pandemic or when the world returns to some sense of normalcy. Who will we become as individuals, as countries, as communities? And of course, there's the anxiety around our own health. You know, am I safe? Will I catch this virus? And will people around me be safe? Will I get sick? Will I survive? So I think there are some really big questions here that really fuel our anxiety, our sense of being in the not knowing, in the unfamiliarity, the acute uncertainty of this moment in Australia, but also around the world. And obviously the question of when will this be over, to which none of us really have an answer. So I think there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear in those questions. And as a result, I think this induces a whole bunch of stress in our bodies, in our systems, which means that we're operating from survival mode. We're not surviving, we're not operating from our most optimal place in our brain because we're in survival mode. So there's a lot of stress. Our body is pumping, you know, a whole bunch of cortisol and other hormones and chemicals to help us just survive each day, just to get through each moment, which is a challenge too to good mental health. I think what's becoming much more spoken about now, and what we're understanding a lot more about right now, is also the grief. And I think grief is a very important piece here when we're talking about our mental health, because not only are we mourning and grieving things in the present, such as our, you know, personal freedoms, our social freedoms. Some people are mourning, you know, their jobs and their income. We're also grieving contact with other people, travel opportunities, routines, pastimes. There's a whole variety of different parts of our lives that we're grieving, but we're also actually grieving what's called, and we're experiencing what's called anticipatory grief. So we also are mourning things that haven't yet happened that we might expect to happen in the future. For example, we might be mourning the fact that we won't be going on that holiday in June, July, or I won't be able to go to that wedding that I was planning to go to at the end of the year, or I won't be able to celebrate, you know, my father's 70th birthday or whatever it is. There's all these things coming up on the calendar which we're already mourning and they haven't even happened. So there's multiple dimensions to this grief. And I think that this is probably right now having the biggest bearing on our lives. Additionally, I would also say that, you know, perhaps another one of the greatest challenges to our mental health right now is isolation and loneliness. And here I'm thinking specifically about single people, elderly people, people who are living in abusive relationships, people who are living in remote communities. There is loneliness has been an epidemic really in our society for a long time before coronavirus, but I think we're feeling and seeing this a lot more right now. And as social creatures, we're not wired, we're not designed to be alone and to live in isolation, whereas this pandemic has really forced us into that. And I think that poses a lot of challenges to our mental health right now. And I know that this is a bit of a tangent to your question, but there have also been upsides to this pandemic, and maybe we can explore some of those later. But in terms of challenges to good mental health, I would argue that anxiety, fear, stress, grief, isolation are up there on the board.
Well, maybe before we go further, maybe we should look at some of the silver linings.
Sure. So I think that we've been forced to just slow down in a really big, significant and meaningful way. And the proverbial rat race that we've all been running at different speeds, at different paces for so long came to an abrupt halt. And as a result, we have been forced to take a breath and to come back to what's really important in our lives, which is typically being health and relationships and connection and community. And at least a lot of the stories I'm hearing from my clients who I still see weekly, a lot of people are experiencing a lot of improved relationships in their lives. And by virtue of the fact that the rat race has stopped and there's no more distractions and there's no more points of comparison to other areas in their lives, they're feeling a whole bunch better. You know, they don't have to, they're no longer worrying about, you know, was my dinner party better than my best friend's dinner party? Or, you know, do I look as good as my neighbor? Or all those crazy comparisons that we tend to do in our lives. You know, is my car nicer than yours? Is my home bigger than theirs? Suddenly it doesn't matter. And it's given people a lot of freedom and liberation in this moment, which I find to be a very positive outcome of this pandemic.
So what are the strategies you think that we can use to help us cope with these, particularly the challenges we're facing?
Yeah, this is a big question, and I have a lot to say here, but I'll preface my comments by saying that I know advice is cheap, and it's not a one-hit wonder. And even though, you know, you can read a lot of strategies and hear a lot of strategies, it doesn't mean that they'll be necessarily easy to implement. So I'll say that as a caveat. But some of the ideas that come to mind, firstly, you know, we have to adhere to the health guidelines that are coming out from our health professionals and our governments and our leaders. I think in terms of allaying anxiety and fear and respecting other people and their boundaries and doing our bit for the common good, we have to be committed to those restrictions and guidelines. I think that routine is actually a really interesting tool for good mental health. And one of the first things that was obliterated by this pandemic was our routine, the routines of our day-to-day lives. And I think if there's a way of rebuilding or reinstalling some sense of routine in our lives, that can actually really help us in a meaningful way. And even if that's as simple as, you know, committing to a time of the day that I wake up, eat my meals, go to bed, do emails, do phone calls, go to the grocery store, whatever it is. But having those kind of set structures and routines in our day can be very, very helpful for our motivation, for our energy, and for our mental health. Another big one here is related to our exposure to the news. And I think that if we're able to moderate our exposure to the news, that can also be really good for us, because the news is full of dark, deathly stories, and too much of it can actually be really bad for us. And this is coming from someone who loves the news. I can literally watch the news 24/7, but I've had to stop myself because it's too much. You know, it's too much hearing these stats all day and dramas and deaths and how many more morgues have been set up in New York City and all those sorts of things. Yes, we need to be informed. Yes, we need to know what's going on, but I think we can moderate how much exposure we have. And I think we also, the more we're able to digest and be critical of our news sources, the better it is for our mental health too. I think that practice, like a gratitude practice, is really helpful these days, you know, focusing on what am I grateful for rather than all the catastrophe around us. So, you know, I might be grateful for the fact that I have work or family or income or food or shelter, or that the sun was beautiful yesterday and I got to go for a walk outdoors. You know, there are simple things, and then they're grander things out there for which we can be grateful. And I think drawing our attention to those things can be really helpful for us in this moment, which is really kind of connected to a second point, which is about focusing on what we can control rather than obsessing on the things that we can't control. And there are actually a lot of things that we can control in this moment in our own day-to-day lives. We can control, you know, what food we're putting into our bodies. We can control what conversations we're having day to day and with who. We can control, for the most part, if we can get some movement outdoors or perhaps even indoors or not. So I think focusing on what we can control gives us a sense of empowerment, gives us a sense of good agency. And I think that too is very helpful and productive for our mental health. Obviously, there's also a whole range of kind of self-care practices that we can engage in. And those, I mean, there's a whole heap of things like poetry, knitting, reading, gardening, prayer, meditation, breathing exercises, just general physical exercise. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do that actually help to mitigate our baseline stress levels. And so at a time of pandemic, at a time of isolation, or even as we come out of isolation, it's really important for us to be thinking about what are those self-care practices that work for us and that we can use to mitigate some of our stress levels. And I think another really important one is professional support. You know, we don't have to go through this alone. And if there is capacity and access to professional support, I would really advocate for that. And I know that it might seem biased because I'm a therapist, but I don't even just mean therapists. I think professional support can come in a multitude of ways, whether that's from a mentor or a spiritual mentor, a thought leader, an author that we admire. I think there's so many creative ways in which we can get support and mentorship in this moment. And I think these are just a few of the things that we can exercise and think about to support good mental health right now.
Thank you. I think a question on the minds of many of us who are very much part of communities is, how can we help each other at this time?
Yeah. I think the best thing we can do right now is to check in with each other, to ask each other that very simple, everyday question of how are you doing, and to not settle for the first answer, because the first answer we're mostly going to get is, yeah, I'm fine, I'm good. Yeah, we're very polite in Australia. You know, we want to go a bit deeper and ask people, how are you really doing? You know, and give people their 3 minutes or their 5 minutes or their 35 minutes of time to really check in. And I think if we can give people that space and be generous in our listening with people, that can be a huge gift right now to others by way of support. So I think checking in and asking people how they're going and being respectful of their responses is wonderful. But beyond just checking in and kind of in addition to checking in, there's other ways that we can reach out to people, you know, whether it's an email, an SMS, a phone call, or even a good old-fashioned letter in the mail, yeah, or a postcard. There's many ways that we can check in and reach out to people. And I think right now, as we kind of move through this disequilibrium in the world, the most fundamental thing that we all want to know right now is that we're loved and that we're cared for and that someone is thinking about us. So I think that this is a really tremendous thing that we can be doing for each other to reach out, particularly people who are more vulnerable. Yeah, and there's a variety of people in our community who are more vulnerable right now. And I think the other thing I would say here is something about compassion and kindness. I think right now we're being called in a way perhaps we haven't been, I certainly have no living memory of. We're being called to be much more compassionate towards other people, as well as to ourselves. But I think we also are being called to manage our expectations of other people right now. And we need to recognize that some people are going to have great days and some people are going to have awful days. And some moments are going to be really joyful and some are going to be really miserable. And some people are going to deliver straight away and some people are going to take their time because they're feeling unproductive for whatever reason. And I think in that relationship, in that dyad, there's a lot that we can do to manage our expectations of others with compassion and with kindness. Yeah.
Thank you. This crisis is passing. We seem to be moving out of it rather than moving into it. And there'll come a time, whether that's 6 months or a year, where it is behind us. What do you think we can take from our change practices at the moment and actually carry them into a time beyond COVID?
Yeah. You know, there's an interesting book, and I'm forgetting the title right now, but there's a very interesting book on trauma. And in this book, they use the analogy of a vase, and I'll just share it with you quickly because I think it might be relevant here. But if you can just imagine for a moment that you had a very precious, maybe sentimental vase sitting on your mantelpiece in your home. You know, it's a prized possession of your family. It's been passed down from generation to generation. And that by some awful design, one day it suddenly falls and it shatters on the ground. Yeah. Once it's fallen and shattered, some people will be very tempted to quickly pick up those pieces and kind of rebuild it, you know, and get the glue and send it to the professionals and piece it back together so that it is what it was before, you know. Whereas other people might be tempted to pick up those shards of glass and to recreate and to rebuild something else, something different, but from those same pieces. Maybe they've built a chessboard, you know, a glass chessboard, or maybe they've built a picture frame out of these glasses, pieces of glass. And while it's different, while the form is different, it still represents and has connection to what was before. I think we're at a very similar moment in our lives right now. I think that life that we knew, the mantelpiece of life that we knew, that was on the mantelpiece has shattered. It's ended, right? And the question now will become, what do we do? Do we race back to try piece together a life that we had pre-COVID-19? Or will we be able to pick up the pieces and create a new order, a new life for ourselves? And so I think that as this pandemic passes and as we return to some normalcy of life, some of the questions we need to be asking ourselves are, you know, in what ways did I adapt to this crisis? In what way did my life adapt? What changes did I make? And what's important to me now? What are the parts of those changes and adaptations that are still important to me now that I want to keep? And I think there's going to be a very interesting temptation to want to run back to what our lives were beforehand. It's kind of like a myth, you know, that we may go back to that time. But I think that there's something about how are we going to integrate what we've learned, what we've achieved, what we've created in this time of pandemic, and how will we integrate that into what life will become afterwards. So, you know, my advice, my cheap advice to people is, you know, that we need to be courageous and daring enough to integrate what we've picked up along the way and into how we're going to integrate that into our lives moving forward. And I also think we need to ask ourselves afterwards at some point, what's been our part in the mess? You know, we've all been a part of the mess in some way, whether it's the products we buy, you know, I don't want to get too political here because that's really not my thing, but in different ways, we're all connected to this mess. And what choices are we going to make that will be different in our lives, in our communities, in our countries afterwards, that may affect a different outcome for the world at large?
I mean, what you're talking about really is a sort of, in a sense, a teshuvah, to consider how the part that we played in it going wrong, and resolving to be different and act differently afterwards. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that this pandemic has exposed a whole bunch of areas that require our attention. You know, a vaccine is a technical solution to a much bigger problem, right? The vaccine will keep us, please God, we have this vaccine soon, but that's going to protect us from the virus, but it's not going to protect us from the injustices and the inequities that this virus has exposed. And I think we all have a part to play in the repairing of that.
How do you think the crisis has deepened our understanding of our own psychological needs? Do we understand ourselves and human beings better now than we did before?
Do we understand ourselves better? I'm not sure about if we understand ourselves better. I would like to believe that we're in that question and we're in that process of understanding more about ourselves. But I think that it's highlighted some very critical light bulbs for us. Maybe one of those is around the importance of slowing down. You know, slowing down has actually also slowed down our nervous systems. And I think that is really important for our psychological safety and our psychological needs. Yeah, just to slow down. It's like we've had an extended Shabbat of sorts, yeah, just to really breathe and take a breath and come back to what matters. There's something, you know, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Esther Perel. who's a very famous psychotherapist now based in New York City. She's actually the daughter of Holocaust survivors. She grew up in Belgium. Her work is tremendous, and I highly encourage anyone to check out her work. But she makes the comment very saliently in her work that the quality of our lives depends on the quality of our relationships. And I think that in terms of psychological needs, something about this pandemic has actually brought us to that piece of wisdom, or highlighted that for us, that it's not really, you know, how fancy my car is or how big my bank account is or any of that. It's somehow we've been drawn back to the relationships in our lives. Who am I spending time with? Who am I missing? Who do I want to spend time with? Who matters to me? All those very important questions about relationships. So I think there's something in relationships that is also very connected to our psychological needs, because again, we're social creatures. We're not designed or wired to be in isolation. And I think connected to that, there's something else there about community and connection. And I think it's been tremendous to see how many virtual communities have popped up and proliferated during this period of time, and how people have come together virtually for the purpose of being in community together. And I think that that also says something about maybe the tribal nature of our psychological needs, because we were never, you know, from the moment we're born into a system, you know, most of us. And there's something very compelling about belonging and being part of community. And then, I mean, I guess another piece here is really just that idea that often less is more. And I can't remember who came up with the expression that, you know, it's often comparison that's the thief of joy. And that in the absence of all these distractions that we have in our day-to-day lives, or that we had in our day-to-day lives, a lot of people seem to be a lot happier, you know, more peace, more calm in their lives. And I think that there's something very interesting there too about our psychological needs. How much do we need all the clutter and all the distractions? And how much do we just need some peacefulness, some calm, some focus in our lives?
It's interesting though how those temptations creep in whatever new environment is created for them. So, you know, speak from a synagogue's point of view, instead of worrying how many people turn up on a Shabbos morning, you're worried about how many people view your Kabbalat Shabbat on Facebook. The thief is still on the prowl. He just comes to a different venue.
Maybe this is part of the human condition.
Yes.
We have to manage rather than erase.
And be more aware of, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. And when is the thief tripping us up and actually taking our attention and our headspace away from the point, you know, away from what really matters?
If I can ask, what have you found particularly challenging, and how have you managed those challenges?
Well, first and foremost, one of the biggest challenges for me has been no access to the gym. I know this might sound very vain, but my gym is actually a very big part of my self-care practice and process for the work that I do. And so I thought initially that I would eat my way through closed gyms, which didn't prove to be very helpful at all. So
you eat less.
I've definitely stacked on some Corona kilos, but more recently I've really committed to taking very long walks. So I've been taking 2 to 3 hour walks each day to really get movement and blood flowing and rushing through my body. But that has been a big issue for me. Another challenge for me has been, well, I'll preface this by saying I'm pretty much a textbook introvert. So kind of lockdown is mostly music to my ears. But I will confess that at times I've been pretty bored, you know, not sure what to do. And there's only so much Netflix I can watch. So one of the things that my partner and I have done is we created like a calendar of activities that we would do every few days. So we had like a no tech day, which I know sounds like Shabbat, but we didn't do it on Shabbat. We did it on a different day of the week. We had one day where we didn't speak for 30 hours. We have had like a Lego day, a poetry day. You know, we've had all these different activities and become
Sounds like summer camp.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly where the idea came from. But it's brought out a lot of creativity in our little one-bedroom apartment, which has been lovely as well. But for the most part, I would say I have been fine, you know, for the most part. But professionally, I guess the biggest challenge for me has been working on a screen all day. I've always thought that the joy of my work as a therapist is that I get to see people all day and not computers, whereas that's been different now because I've been doing all my work online. So what I try to do to manage that is very intentionally to detox from my screens when I'm not working, yeah, as much as possible.
Before I invite the rest of the crowd to raise issues that are of interest to them, is there just anything else you wanted to share or you wanted to leave us with?
You know, in terms of mental health, I have you know, I'm thinking a lot these days about the fact that health is not just the absence of illness. Yeah, health. There's something in this concept of health that's related to the way in which we live our lives and the choices that we make moment to moment, day by day, that feed into and tie into that overarching and overall sense of health that we may experience. And I think the same is true for mental health, that you know, mental health is not just about problem solution, you know, take a pill, feel better, etc., etc. I think that good mental health, or what I prefer to call mental wealth, is about all the decisions that we're making, the self-care practices and choices we're making moment to moment, day by day, to look after ourselves and to be good and kind and compassionate to ourselves. So yeah, that just feels important to mention here for a moment. I'm not exactly sure why, but it just felt important to mention because this epidemic, this pandemic, sorry, is really challenging us to rethink every aspect of our lives. And I hope that in that investigation, we're able to really pinpoint moments and areas where we are able to exercise and make better decisions for ourselves that will hopefully contribute to a more generalized sense of improved mental health.